In the forgotten corners of eastern Kentucky, where dense pine forests stand like watchful guardians and the wind carries voices long ignored, there once stood a place so feared that locals only dared mention it in hushed tones. They called it Thornhill Asylum for the morally defective child. Between 1865 and 1897, over 400 children were sent there. Most never returned. Officially, it was a Christian rehabilitation home for troubled youth. Unofficially, it became one of the most effective death machines of the post-Civil War South. What occurred within Thornhill's chapel, later transformed into a laboratory, was hidden for over a century until now. Recently uncovered church records, medical files, and sealed letters reveal a narrative that is deeply unsettling. This isn't just a story about one deranged man. It's about a family dynasty, a religious facade, and an industry built on suffering. Before we proceed, a warning. This story is not for the faint-hearted. If you're looking for comfort, this is not the place. But if you believe that the darkest truths of history should be brought to light, no matter how deeply they're buried, then stay with us. Also, drop a comment and tell us where you're listening from, because the shadow of Thornhill stretches further than you might expect. Let's begin in 1865. Just as the Civil War ended and a grieving, fractured nation turned to faith for answers, that's when the Calderon family opened their doors to children with nowhere else to go. But those doors only opened one way. To understand Thornhill's horrors, we must first understand the people who built it. The Calderon family arrived in Kentucky in the spring of 1865, just weeks after the Confederacy's surrender. Leading them was Reverend Silas Calderon, a former battlefield chaplain turned child reformer. He brought two things: a message of divine order and a plan for institutional salvation. Silas was a tall, hawk-eyed man in his early 50s, with a preacher's voice capable of turning fire and brimstone into lullabies. He claimed to have received visions on the battlefield, visions of fallen children who could only be redeemed through strict discipline, obedience, and purification. His wife, Temperance Calderon, was rarely seen in public. Locals described her as frail, though some whispered she'd once been institutionalized herself. Their 4 children, however, left a lasting impression. Elias, the eldest at 29, was a licensed physician, though he never practiced in any formal hospital. Instead, he served as Thornhill's in-house medical examiner, collecting anatomical texts and surgical tools with what others called a morbid curiosity. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was often about cleansing the soul through physical recalibration. Next was Josephine, 6, soft-spoken, radiant, praised for her music and charity. Yet, survivors described her as the most terrifying of them all. She played piano hymns during nighttime sessions, telling the children that their cries proved the devil was leaving them. Then came the twins, Nathaniel and Mercy, aged 21 when Thornhill opened. Nathaniel managed daily operations, assigning rooms, directing staff, and monitoring arrivals. Mercy worked in the reflection wing, a name disguising its real function: isolation, starvation, and confinement. Lastly, there was Silas's brother, Dr. Alban Calderon, a defrocked neurologist from Baltimore with no formal license but extensive knowledge of 19th century brain mapping, phrenology, and cognitive obedience therapy. He created what would later be called the silent chamber. You might wonder, how did a family like this operate openly for over 3 decades? The answer is simple. They cloaked themselves in religion, patriotism, and philanthropy. Silas was named honorary chaplain of the Kentucky Orphan Relief Fund. Elias donated to medical supply drives. Josephine published devotional poetry in church newsletters, and Thornhill was advertised as a refuge, a second chance for morally broken children. But once inside, there were no second chances, only records. Records sealed until 1972, revealing a pattern so calculated, so cold, that even seasoned FBI archivists reportedly left in silence. We'll explore those files soon. But first, let's understand how Thornhill itself was built, because it wasn't just a hospital. It was a machine. Have you ever seen a building that feels wrong before you even step inside? Not haunted, but designed for something other than salvation? That's how survivors described Thornhill Chapel. Its gray stone walls were imported from Virginia. Stained glass windows depicted St. Augustine, St. Paul, and most prominently, a sword-wielding archangel standing over a weeping child. The chapel could seat 120, yet rarely held more than 10. Public worship wasn't its purpose, obedience was. The chapel was built first before dorms, clinics, or kitchens. Old blueprints rediscovered in a state archive in 1994 revealed the building had a full basement, never mentioned in official documents. There was no exterior access, no emergency exits. Most disturbingly, the basement contained 12 small, windowless rooms, each with shackles bolted to the stone, narrow drainage trenches, and a hidden vent system capable of delivering heat or something more sinister. At the basement's far end was a room labeled Observation Chamber B, connected by a corridor to Dr. Alban Calderon's private lab. If this sounds familiar, it should. It's not unlike later atrocities like Ravensbrück or Tuskegee, except this was 3 decades earlier, and it was children. Visitors, donors, and clergy saw a very different Thornhill. Prayer circles, clean beds, smiling staff, Josephine playing hymns, Silas reading scripture, but they never saw behind the altar. Behind the wooden crucifix and velvet curtain lay a hidden trapdoor, leading to a space the Calderons called the penumbra, Latin for the edge of shadow. You might ask, how did this persist for 30 years without exposure? Someone did speak up. In 1873, a young coal worker named Ellis Rowe reported hearing cries beneath the chapel during a delivery. A week later, he was found drowned in Mill Pond Lake, mouth filled with gravel. The coroner ruled it an accident, and no one reported anything again for 18 years. Thornhill's architecture was intentional, ritualistic. The chapel's acoustics, the pew arrangement, all designed not for prayer but for silence. When the doors shut and the hymns played, no one heard what happened below. Children were taught from day one that the basement wasn't real, just a story to keep them obedient. But the screams? The screams were real. To understand why the Calderons did this, you need to read their doctrine, not the Bible they displayed, but the handwritten book locked behind Elias's surgical desk, The Doctrine of Broken Things. It was never published, never meant to be seen. Yet thanks to a fire inspector's report in 1978, parts of it survived, charred but legible. Their theology was twisted. Certain children were born morally fractured. Not evil, just wrong. Born of mixed blood, illegitimacy, trauma, or mental illness. Children without spiritual architecture, incapable of responding to ordinary mercy. Their salvation, Silas wrote, required suffering calibrated to divine order. They tortured children because of their beliefs, not to spite them. One passage reads, "The vessel must be shattered before it can be sanctified." The cries of the weak are not pain, but purification. Another, "A child's silence is not trauma, but the start of correction. He who screams resists. He who submits becomes clay." They called it reform through collapse, isolation, hunger, exposure to cold, followed by guidance through restraints, hallucinations, and direct suggestion. Sound familiar? Modern psychology calls it trauma bonding. Cults call it breaking through. The Calderones called it grace. By the 1870s, Thornhill had a formal intake program. Children came by train or cart, usually from overwhelmed orphanages or families hiding a secret. The same phrase appeared on every form: involuntary placement for moral realignment. Children were evaluated by Josephine and Elias within 48 hours. If compliant, they went to dorms. If they resisted, lied, stuttered, or flinched, Category 3, sent below. If they ran, they became non-viables. What happened to them remains undocumented, but they were never reassigned. Was there no oversight? Few who raised concerns remained for long. In 1875, a nurse named Margaret Bellamy wrote to the Kentucky Board of Mental Health, expressing concern over Thornhill's practices. 3 weeks later, she was diagnosed with melancholic hysteria and committed to St. Jude's Sanatorium, where she died of self-starvation within 8 months. Her complaint was never investigated. So I ask again, how many knew? How many believed when the Calderones said, "This is the Lord's work"? Once you accept that some children are better off broken, anything becomes permissible. At Thornhill, it certainly was. In the northern hills of Pennsylvania, where moss clings to rusted iron gates and time weaves itself into the bark of sycamore trees, there once stood a building with no listed address. Locals knew it by many names: the Hill House, the Saints' Home, the Quiet Farm. But the name engraved on the stone arch above its corroded entrance was St. Alora's House of Restoration for Wayward Girls, 1862. No one speaks that name anymore. The building's stone walls collapsed long ago, swallowed by vines and layers of wet leaves. The path leading to the hilltop vanished under thorny brush and decades of neglect. You could live just 20 meters from its remains and never realize it was ever there, exactly as the church had intended. Yet the dead have a persistent way of resurfacing. I wasn't searching for it when I discovered the ledger. It was mid-October when the university sent me to assist in cataloging parish records from the now defunct Diocese of Wren's Hollow. Just another freelance research job, sorting through names, dates, and barely legible baptismal records. Then, hidden inside a mislabeled box of funeral notices, I found it, a bound leather journal, brittle and tied with a black ribbon, reeking of mildew and vinegar. Stamped on the cover in faded gold script were the words "Inventory, St. Alora's House of Restoration, 1862 to 1891, that name again. I'd never heard of it before. There was no record in the diocesan archives, no registry, no map. But inside were 143 entries, each listing a girl's first name, followed by a number, then a final column titled Fate. Most entries simply read departed, no dates, no details. A few were marked only with an X, and some were left blank entirely. There were no departure letters, no adoption records, no transfer documents. Only those names: Clara, Justine, Rosalind, Elsie. Names inked in fading script unsaid for over a century. That's when the dreams began. The origin of St. Alora's was never formally recorded in church bulletins, but by piecing together whispers from archived correspondence and old inspection notices, a fragmented history emerged. In 1861, with the nation embroiled in civil war and orphanages overwhelmed, Mother Agatha Vale, a cloistered nun from Baltimore reputed to have visions of the Virgin, proposed establishing a moral reformatory for young women deemed impure. Her idea was stark: remove temptation from the world by removing the girls from it. She acquired a secluded hillside 17 miles from the town of Carrollton, once owned by a lumber company. The land was quietly purchased by the Order of St. Josephine, and within 8 months, construction began. They didn't build a school, they built a fortress. St. Alora's consisted of a main residence hall, a chapel with a bell tower, servant quarters, farming fields, and an incinerator connected to the laundry house. The stone walls were 18 inches thick, windows narrow and high, doors locked from the outside. There were no telegraph lines, no visitors, no public records. What they had instead was strict discipline, religious doctrine, and silence. The first group of girls arrived in the winter of 1862, 12 of them, aged between 9 and 16. Some were orphans. Others came from affluent families who paid tuition to have their daughters hidden away for acts of rebellion, promiscuity, or even just being too clever. In return, they were promised moral salvation, but it came at a steep price. Fragments of letters from Elias Furlow, a former groundskeeper, surfaced decades later in a Bible found in his grandson's attic. He wrote that upon arrival, the girls were stripped of their names, assigned numbers, dressed in gray wool uniforms, their heads shaved, and their voices silenced, and to be like lambs, he wrote, silent and clean before the slaughter. Mother Agatha didn't see herself as a warden, but as a spiritual midwife guiding sinful girls toward sainthood through suffering. She believed sin resided in the bones and that repentance demanded excavation. Her methods followed ancient ascetic traditions: fasting, self-flagellation, and extended isolation in dark spaces called reflection chambers. Her deputy, Sister Marcella, had once served in a French penal convent and was in charge of discipline and physical correction. A note scribbled in the margin of an inspection report quotes her, referring to bruises as the flowerings of obedience. Sister Eugenie, once an apothecary, maintained a locked cabinet of tinctures and herbs used in what she called spiritual cleansings. In reality, she administered substances that clouded memory, disturbed sleep, and induced fevered hallucinations, visions later extracted as confessions. Staff worked in rotating groups of 3, always silent, always observing. Journals were confiscated, letters home rewritten or destroyed. The girls were told no one would believe them, and in time they ceased trying to speak. The last public mention of St. Alora's appeared in spring 1865, a brief paragraph in a local parish newsletter. We commend the continued work of Mother Vale and her sisters at St. Alora. May their perseverance guide lost girls back to divine light. Then nothing. No news articles, no church inspection reports, no survivor testimonies. Just silence until now. I held that ledger for days, uncertain of what to do. Every time I opened it, it felt like desecrating a grave. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I dreamt of faceless girls behind narrow windows, of muffled voices beneath floorboards, of a bell ringing where no tower stood. Eventually, I took a leave of absence. I drove to Wren's Hollow, an old coal town slowly fading in the valley. At a diner off Route 29, I asked a server if she'd ever heard of St. Alora. She paused, then whispered, "You mean the Hill House?" The locals called her a saint. Mother Agatha Vale arrived in Pennsylvania with 3 trunks, a weathered leather Bible, and a presence that quieted rooms. She was barely 5 feet tall, but her voice was low and deliberate, her gaze steady enough to unsettle grown men. She claimed to have been called. In personal letters unofficially archived by a skeptical priest, she described a vision of the Immaculate Virgin, radiant, weeping, kneeling in ash. The vision, she wrote, had given her a mission. Second, the girls' letters home were either rewritten or discarded. They were told no one would believe them, and eventually they stopped trying to speak at all. The last known public mention of St. Theora's came in the spring of 1865. A single paragraph in a local parish newsletter read, We commend the continued work of Mother Vale and her sisters at St. Elora. May their perseverance guide lost girls back to divine light. After that, nothing. No newspaper articles, no official church inspections, no survivor testimonies. Just silence until now. I held the ledger for days, unsure what to do with it. Each time I opened it, it felt like I was disturbing a grave. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I dreamt of faceless girls standing behind narrow windows, of muffled voices beneath floorboards, of a bell ringing where no tower stood. Eventually, I took a leave of absence. I drove to the last known location, Wren's Hollow, an old coal town slowly dying in the valley. At a diner off Route 29, I asked a server if she'd ever heard of St. Elora. She paused, then whispered, "You mean the Hill House?" The locals called her a saint. Mother Agatha Vale arrived in Pennsylvania with 3 trunks, a worn leather Bible, and the kind of presence that silenced rooms. She was barely 5 feet tall, but her voice was low and controlled, always measured and never rushed. Her eyes were sharp as slate and could hold a gaze long enough to unnerve grown men. She said she had been called. In her personal letters, unofficially archived by a skeptical priest, she described a vision of the Immaculate Virgin, radiant, weeping, kneeling in ash. The vision, she wrote, instructed her to cleanse the nation's girls of impurity and to build a house of obedience in a land consumed by chaos. The Civil War was raging, families were splintered, and morality, she believed, was eroding like the banks of the Allegheny. So she built a wall, figuratively and literally, to keep the world's corruption out and the sanctified within. But she did not do it alone. Like any empire of cruelty, St. Elora had its architects. Each played their role with the precision of a cathedral clock. Sister Marcella, the arm of correction, tall, stern and molded by strict discipline, Sister Marcella served as the enforcer. She came from a defunct convent in Normandy, where physical mortification was seen as holy. Beneath her habit, she wore a leather strap wrapped around her ribs, made a reminder of divine pain. Her hands were large and calloused from years of manual penance. Marcella oversaw both corporal and psychological discipline. Girls who resisted were subjected to the stations of reflection, a ritual punishment modeled after the Passion. Each station corresponding to humiliation, denial, restraint, or starvation. She believed pain was the only honest language of the impure. A surviving note from an anonymous girl reads, "She made me kneel in rice for 2 hours. I lost feeling in my legs. She whispered behind me, 'Let your body break so your spirit might live.'" Sister Eugenie, the healer of the mind. Not all scars were visible. Sister Eugenie, with her soft voice and gentle manner, offered healing tinctures and cleansing teas. In truth, she was a chemical manipulator, trained in apothecary work before joining the order. She blended foxglove, belladonna, datura, and laudanum, substances meant to induce weakness, visions, and silence. Girls who drank her infusions reported vivid dreams, memory lapses, and a sense of disembodiment. In the ledgers, these were labeled episodes of grace. Girls who reacted violently were isolated. Those who claimed to see angels or the Blessed Mother were paraded in chapel to testify to their transformation. Their hallucinations became confessions. Eugenie kept meticulous records of each girl's tolerance, behavior, and susceptibility. She called it spiritual pharmacology. Brother Thorn, the builder brother. Thorn was the only man allowed on the grounds. He claimed to be a defrocked Jesuit, though no record of his ordination exists. Tall and silent, with yellowed fingernails and ink-stained palms, he always wore his cassock buttoned to the throat and avoided eye contact. He built the reflection chambers, underground tunnels, and night corridors that allowed staff to move unseen after dark. He supervised the labor of the quiet choir, a rotating group of drugged, half-conscious girls forced to clean and maintain the grounds in silence. Letters from Sister Corvina hinted at Thorne's penchant for experimentation. Girls he favored were never seen again. Tools went missing from the laundry, locks were reinforced, and the chapel basement was forbidden. No one questioned why his boots were often muddy long after sunset. Sister Isolde, the record keeper, if Eugenie, dulled the mind and Marcella broke the body. Sister Isolde erased the memory. She was the most dangerous. Not because she inflicted pain, but because she made the world forget these girls existed. Isolde managed all external communications. She wrote letters to families, filed forged progress reports, and signed notes in the girls' handwriting. She studied their speech patterns, mimicked their phrasing, and created a facade of stability for outsiders. If a family pressed too hard, she would respond, "Your daughter is progressing marvelously in spiritual maturity. She is not ready for earthly distractions." She maintained the White Ledger, the official diocesan record of admissions, baptisms, and transfers, with no mention of deaths, accidents, or incidents. But hidden beneath her cot, wrapped in oilcloth, was the Red Ledger. There were no headings, just numbers and blunt notations. Number 31, refused communion, removed. Number 58, spoke during night silence and confession failed, transferred. Number 112, attempted escape, reassigned TT. What TT stood for wasn't clear, not until much later. The doctrine of Agatha. Mother Agatha's spiritual philosophy was a blend of Catholic orthodoxy, medieval mysticism, and psychological control. She wrote sermons titled The Womb of Obedience, Penance as Architecture, and Breaking the Mirror, Erasure of Selfhood for Glory. She saw each girl as a vessel to be emptied and refilled with divine light. To achieve this, she believed the name, voice, and memory had to be stripped away. She didn't call them daughters, she called them offerings. By 1870, the population at St. Elora hovered around 60 to 70 girls, yet the annual intake was closer to 20 to 30, so where were they going? There were no transfers, no graves, no public records of departure. The numbers never rose, nor did they fall, and because Agatha, Marcella, Eugenie, Isolde, and Thorne had built more than a reformatory. They had created a self-contained system of purification and erasure, and the world, distracted by wars and epidemics, let it happen. One fragment from a confiscated journal, recovered in 1902 during the demolition of a nearby barn, was written by a girl named Clara Malin. It reads, "I am not allowed to say my name. They call me 41. I have not seen outside in 5 months. My friend Elsie was taken during night prayers. Her bed is gone. Her name is gone. No one says anything. The silence is thicker than the walls. I think she died. I think I will too." The world never ran out of girls. The intake records in the White Ledger were sterile and clinical. Name, date of arrival, parish sponsor, payment status. But beneath that thin paper was a darker mechanism, a machine built on control, fear, and the silent complicity of those who never asked questions. And it all began with a letter. A woman who called herself a teacher of forgotten girls began teaching them to speak. Again, softly, clearly, in their own words. The evidence she gathered was substantial. Dozens of forged ledgers, letters from missing girls, ledger pages marked with burns and blood, photographs of numbered sleeves, cracked bricks, and scorched hymnals. All of these materials were mailed anonymously from scattered towns across Massachusetts and Vermont. By the end of 1880, over 137 pages of documentation had reached journalists, bishops, and a single skeptical prosecutor in Albany. Yet no formal charges were ever filed. The church initiated an internal inquiry, but no arrests followed. Mother Agatha was deemed unfit for leadership due to age-related decline and was quietly moved to a hospice in Rome. Sister Isolde disappeared from the registry of the Order of Saint Josephine. Rumors circulated that she drowned during a ferry crossing, but her body was never recovered. Brother Thorn retired, though no one ever saw him leave. His workshop was sealed and the furnace dismantled in silence. Sister Marcella was transferred to a convent in the Pyrenees for spiritual rest. She died within the year, reportedly from a respiratory illness, though no autopsy was performed. The official report from the Archdiocese stated, while administrative inconsistencies and regrettable oversights were identified, no criminal activity was substantiated. The Order of St. Josephine acted in accordance with spiritual directives. The matter is closed. 3 weeks later, a journalist who had advocated for a criminal trial was found dead in a river near New Haven. His death was ruled an accidental drowning, and his investigative notes were never recovered. Privately disturbed by the patterns, one bishop requested that St. Alora be deconsecrated. Yet bureaucracy, funding issues, and shifting priorities delayed the process. By 1883, the asylum stood mostly abandoned. The dormitories were gutted, the chapel roof collapsed under winter snow, and vines overtook the east wall. Yet despite its ruin, no one approached the cold ward. Locals avoided it, and children dared each other to knock on its doors. None stayed more than a few seconds. Some claimed you could still hear the night choir humming beneath the floorboards. In 1891, a woman named Miriam Wells sent a letter to a Boston publisher. She was in her late 50s, working as a housemaid. In her letter, she claimed to have been one of the original girls transferred from St. Alora in 1859. She described her experiences. They told us we were sent to serve God. I scrubbed blood from the flagstones. I was 12. The last thing my sister said to me was, "Don't let them make you forget who you are." I did. For 30 years, I'm sorry. The publisher filed the letter away. It was never printed. But in 1913, during the demolition of the remaining asylum ruins, workers found a sealed iron box behind the altar, embedded in the stone. Inside were a psalter, scorched but readable, a lock of hair wrapped in linen, a list of 143 names identified only by initials, and a final note signed simply CM. It read, "If you find this, believe it. They made a place that swallowed girls. Do not let it be silent again." The box was handed over to the historical committee, cataloged and then misplaced. Today, the site of St. Alora is just a field. The stones have sunken into the earth. The chapel bell lies cracked in a museum basement unmarked. The old iron gate is rusted shut, vines threading through its bars like veins. There are no plaques, no graves, no names. Yet some older locals still avoid the area. They say when the wind is just right, you can hear soft singing in the grass, and not a hymn but a lullaby. They called it the home on Red Hollow Hill, an orphanage long shuttered and scheduled for demolition in the spring of 1998. The grounds were overgrown, the chimney partially collapsed. But behind a bricked-over alcove in the west corridor, a construction crew found a metal case wedged between the rafters. It was small, rusted shut. Inside was a girl's journal, with entries from 1861 to 1862, a folded list of 143 first names, 2 photographs, one of a girl in numbered linens, another of the cracked incinerator door, a child's rosary, partially melted, and a letter barely legible. If no one remembers us, we vanished twice. Tell the truth even if no one listens. Tell it anyway. CM. The initials matched those found years earlier. During the St. Alora demolition, CM stood for Clara. Mullen, but this time, the box wasn't lost in an archive. This time someone paid attention. Sarah Dorsey, a doctoral student at Wellesley studying the ethics of institutional care, took up the trail. She traced the initials to a death registry in Vermont, where she found the obituary of Elra Miles, who died in 1922, yet the handwriting in Elra's letters matched the journal found at Red Hollow. The same loops on the L's, the same unfinished T-strokes. It was her. Clara Mullen had survived and spent her final decades writing, archiving, and leaving a trail for anyone to follow. Sarah spent the next 3 years combing through state archives, private church registries, and abandoned diocesan files. Every name she traced from the list, the 143 girls, told the same story. No death certificates, no transfer records erased from church registries, families who never heard from them again. Some families still lived in the area, most having stopped asking after generations of silence. But when Sarah knocked on their doors and shared what she had found, tears came and long-held stories resurfaced. One elderly woman, Martha Wren, recalled an old family story about a girl named Joanna who fled a terrible school. They said she ran off with gypsies, but my grandmother always whispered it differently, that she got out, and they never forgave her for it. Martha held up a necklace with a broken bell. I think this was hers. I think she wanted us to remember. The New England Historical Society agreed to help. By 2002, a formal project was launched, the Elora Memory Archive. Volunteers scanned pages, transcribed fading ink, searched burial plots, and cross-referenced parish records. They confirmed 41 names of girls with matching dates of entry into St. Elora and no records of exit. They uncovered remnants of Sister Isolde's ledgers in a Vatican side collection labeled apocryphal teaching records. Between the pages of a lost hymnal, they found a note in Sister Eugenie's handwriting. The furnace makes us clean. The silence makes us safe. On March 13, 2005, a small memorial was placed near the field where the asylum once stood. It was simple, a plaque etched in black stone, in memory of the silenced 143 girls, known only to God, once taken, now remembered. The truth will not rot in the ground. Dedicated by survivors, descendants, and witnesses. Every year since, people leave offerings, ribbons with numbers, letters addressed to the girls of the choir, small bells, silent. And every so often, when the wind shifts just right, you can hear it in the grass, a song without lyrics, a breath caught in stone, the memory of children who never stopped waiting to be found.